Well, good morning and welcome to day 4 of Louisiana Wind Week. We've covered a lot of ground so far, and we will cover a lot more ground today and tomorrow to round out the week. My name is Harry Vorhoff. I'm the Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. Today, we'll be focusing on connecting offshore wind to end users. This is a critical step or steps in project development and involves questions like what the electricity will be used for, how to get the electricity where it needs to go, and who ultimately will pay for it. These are complex questions to answer, so I'm delighted to have some of the most knowledgeable people working in this space on our panel today. We'll start it off with a presentation from Josh Ganji, Renewable Energy Program Specialist with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. After, we'll pause for some Q&A. We'll then open it up to a roundtable discussion moderated by Paul Zimmering, member of the law firm Stone Pigman, Walther and Whitman. Our panelists include Jennifer Curran, Vice President, System Planning and Chief Compliance Officer with the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, Andrew Tusillo, Chief of Staff for the Office of New Orleans Council Member at Large, Helena Moreno, Brendan Frye, Executive Secretary of the Louisiana Public Service Commission, Jonathan Berg, Director of Resource Planning and Marketing Operations at Entergy Louisiana, Logan Atkinson Burke, Executive Director of the Alliance for Affordable Energy, and James Cotter, General Manager, Offshore Wind Americas with Shell. Each panelist will offer opening remarks and then we'll start fielding questions from you, the audience, our moderator, Mr. Zimmering, as well as the fellow panelists. How to participate. If you have a question, you can either type it into the chat feature or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, or if you would like to verbalize your comments and speak to them, you can raise your hand, which is located under the reactions on the lower part of your screen, and I'll unmute you at the appropriate time. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Mr. Ganji will tee up his and offer our first presentation. As I mentioned, Josh has been a renewable energy, or is a renewable energy program specialist with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and has been in that position since 2017. In this role, he's a project coordinator for the federal review of wind projects offshore New England, New York, and the Mid-Atlantic. He also works to develop Bureau policy on offshore wind transmission issues. Prior to his time at BOEM, Josh worked with NOAA and the Global Environment Facility. Josh holds a law degree from NYU and a master's degree in environmental management from Yale University. Josh, with that, the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
Loud and clear.
And see my screen, I hope. Great. So on the topic of connecting offshore wind to users, this is perhaps the most literal definition of that in connecting the electricity to the grid. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the transmission framework that BOEM uses to manage transmission. So these are the regulatory provisions that allow us to do so, and I will not read them to you, but for those that are interested in regulatory language, please feel free to reference this slide later. So before I get started, I just wanted to highlight that transmission planning is a very complex process that involves a lot of people. And this is due to, the sort of the unique nature of it, in that unlike something like oil and gas production, there's limited ability to store the commodity or export it to different markets. So you're really quite dependent upon local conditions. So just to highlight some of the folks that are involved in this process, and you'll hear from many of them today that will do a much more thorough job explaining it. Just wanted to run through a little bit. First, BOEM, we're sort of the landlord here. We do the leasing for the wind projects and the easements or right-of-ways to connect the offshore wind resource to the grid. FERC manages the electric grid system at a federal level. And then also there's various permitting agencies that are involved in providing permits for natural resource management, et cetera. In addition, you may have a grid operator, an independent system operator, or regional transmission operator that manages at a more regional level and will do a grid connection study to show how and at what cost it'll take to connect an offshore wind project. And then the state role, which I can't really overemphasize the importance of this, is really what drives whether or not offshore wind projects go forward. This may be through renewable energy goals or legislation specifically procuring offshore wind projects. In those procurements, they often place conditions on the offtake agreements that may direct where and how a project can be connected, or put conditions on such as local content rules or those sorts of things. And then, of course, the state utilities have to be involved to get that power once it connects to the grid, to the right places, to the load centers. And then there may be property interests involved in those landfall connection points. And along the coast, there may be a limited number of appropriate landfall connection points. And I'll get into that a little later. So under the BOEM system, there's essentially two paths for transmission as that we can go with. One is probably the more simple one to understand, which is transmission is part of an offshore wind lease. Per our regulations, any lease confers the right to one or more non-competitive easements. So this means that anyone that owns an offshore wind lease from us has the right to say, to propose a route to shore. And the other option is transmission under a right-of-way grant. And this would be where you have a third party coming in to connect one or more offshore wind resources to the grid. And I'll get into a little more detail here. So as part of a lease, the process is a lessee that owns the lease would negotiate with the state entities and utilities that might, where appropriate, to determine an appropriate landfall and grid connection point. They may do a grid connection. They may have to do a grid connection study with the appropriate ISO where that exists, and the ISO might determine the need for the upgrades for interconnection and pass along those costs to the developer. It's important to note that BOEM doesn't have jurisdiction over the landfall sites or the state waters, so this really is a collaborative process. Once that's all sort of worked out, an easement is granted to shore with the lease, and the details of that are provided to BOEM as part of the construction and operations plan, and that's analyzed under that for technical feasibility, environmental impacts, et cetera. And again, under our process, the easement may be presented as options under a project design envelope. So they could say, we're considering multiple routes to different points of interconnection along the shore, and it's through that evaluation and NEPA process that the preferred option is ultimately selected. The right-of-way grant process is a little more complicated, but essentially the first step in this process is OXLA requires a competitive process for us, unless BOEM determines there's not competitive interest. So we would likely issue a request for competitive interest to see if there are other parties that are interested in using that same exact spot for a transmission project. We would also solicit information about the area because it has to be determined that it's also in the public interest to issue that right-of-way grant. If there was competition, we would use a competitive process, probably similar to an auction like we use for our lease sales. And again, we will conduct environmental analyses and multiple use conflicts prior to making a decision on whether to issue that grant. So once that has been issued, the grant holder then has a year to provide a general activities plan, which is similar to our construction and operations plan on the wind side, allows them to do survey work, identify any impediments to the project, and discusses what methods and equipment they're going to use. And that triggers additional NEPA review and consultation with other agencies. And under the same framework, I just wanted to touch on the idea of regional transmission options. So this would be connecting multiple projects along something along like a backbone system, where you would have multiple projects offshore connected together and then connected to various points onshore. This would again be under the right-of-way grant process. BOEM's unlikely to be able to require the use of an unbuilt system. So this would be the sort of the coordination there is a bit more, more involved. But a lessee proposing to use a regional transmission system could be granted an easement to that system offshore. And the state has a bit more power here because through their offtake mechanism, they could mandate such a use. Say, we're going to buy your power, but you have to use this backbone system. And just a few more details on what a right-of-way entails. It's a qualified entity, so they're legally, technically, financially qualified to do that by BOEM first. What a right-of-way is roughly a 200 feet strip of the seafloor in width centered on the cable. Although for demonstrated reasons, you could ask for a bit more. It's not an exclusive right, so it doesn't prevent granting of other rights or cable crossings, and they can't unreasonably interfere with other approved activities in existing operations. So, and with that, also BOEM does require financial assurance for decommissioning of such a system, all our systems really. So with that, I know I've gone through that pretty quickly and had a lot of information there, so I'm happy to answer any questions, and also my contact information there is at the bottom. So if anyone wants to reach out directly, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate that was concise but very informative. So thank you. We'll pause here for some questions. We do have a question from Andrew Como. What rates did consumers pay for electricity in Rhode Island before the offshore wind project, and what are they paying now? And how does that compare to consumers, what consumers are paying for electricity in Louisiana now? So I don't know, Josh, if you have an idea on
I don't.
Block Island.
Yeah. So technically, the project off Block Island it was in state waters, so it's technically a state project. I don't have the specifics on the pricing, but I do know that prior to the connection of the offshore wind system there, they were not connected to the mainland. So the island itself was using diesel generation for power, so that they had very high rates compared to most of the country. And part of that project was connecting not only the wind resource, but also the island to the mainland. So there was that benefit provided as well. But as for the exact rates, I may have to defer to someone else.
And I just Googled it, and it looks like the island was paying above 50 cents a kilowatt hour. So pretty high. And I see Mr. Frye has his hand raised.
Sure, and I think I can answer some of the questions Louisiana specific. I was looking at numbers, and the latest numbers I've got are April numbers. So that would include some of the higher fuel costs that we experienced in February that would be folded into our rates. But Louisiana in April was the lowest rate, and this is retail rates at 9.3 cents a kilowatt hour in the country. For that same month, Rhode Island was 18.64 cents a kWh. And there was a note on the chart I was looking at that Rhode Island customers are paying 20% higher than they were in 2018. I don't know if that's tied to the project, but their retail rates are roughly double what ours are.
Gotcha. Thank you, Brandon. There's another question from Joe Thacker. Would a wind developer need a GAP or a COP?
So for a wind project,
do you mind explaining the acronyms also?
Yep. There's two mechanisms. The COP is a construction and operations plan, and this is in the case of an offshore wind project. So the wind farm itself requires a construction and operations plan, and this is where they describe exactly what they're proposing to build. So Our leases, when we issue a lease, there's not a project in mind quite yet. What that gets them when they purchase the lease is the ability to do site investigations to allow for them to then propose what they think is the most reasonable project based on, physical characteristics and also what an adjacent state is wanting to procure from them. So it's at that stage, the construction operations plan, where you really get the range of possibilities of what a project would entail. And the transmission piece of that, the easement that goes along with the lease, is analyzed under the construction operations plan. In the case of a third-party system where someone's looking to connect another project to shore or to another project, for example, that's a general activities plan, the GAP, the GAP, and that's essentially the same thing, but perhaps a bit less detail is involved because it's not as complex a structure.
Thanks, Josh. I do see another question, but I think it might be good to have opening comments just because I think that'll possibly answer some questions and then we can follow up. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Paul Zimmering, who concentrates his practice in public utilities regulation. He has represented the Louisiana Public Service Commission for many years, including in proceedings involving the quantification and recoverability of the cost to electric utilities for repair and rebuilding due to damage caused by hurricanes and tropical storms, as well as the securitization of those costs, and represented them in state and federal proceedings regarding the potential movement of electric utilities to regional transmission organizations. Paul taught public utility and energy regulation, as well as advanced seminars on those topics for 20 years. And I personally was lucky enough to be one of those students for one of those years. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Harry. Good morning and welcome again to day 4 of Louisiana Wind Week. It's an honor to be moderating a panel of such distinguished and very smart individuals on the topic connecting offshore wind to users. Thanks to Josh for that initial terrific presentation. Just a few words, the quick mandatory disclaimer, and then I'm going to get out of the way and let the panelists take over. As Harry indicated, I've been representing the Louisiana Public Service Commission since the end of the Spanish-American War, actually since 1979, and I continue to represent the commission today. Most of my work is at the retail level, but I've participated on behalf of the commission in numerous FERC proceedings, and we have responsibility for a number of MISO monitoring matters. Okay, the disclaimer. Any views that I express today are my views and my views alone. They do not represent policies or positions taken by the Louisiana Public Service Commission or any individual commissioner in the past or into the future. Just a moment on logistics. Each additional member of the panel, and I think Josh is going to try to stay with us for the 2 hours, we'll provide a brief presentation and then we'll open it up for questions from stakeholders directed either to an individual presenter or to the panel as a whole. And we'll leave plenty of time for that question and answer period. No particular order other than this was the order that Harry sent me, the names and contact information for all the panelists. We're going to start with Jennifer Curran. I'm very pleased to introduce Jennifer Curran. Jennifer is the Vice President of System Planning and the Chief Compliance Officer with the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator Regional Transmission Organization. In that role, Jennifer oversees MISO's transmission and resource planning efforts, market operations, planning for those operations, as well as the company's work to comply with state and federal electricity standards. Obviously, she's got a lot on her plate on a daily basis. Jennifer has been with MISO since 2004. Prior to joining MISO, Jennifer was the manager of power generation and supply strategy for MISO and PJM at Reliant Resources. Jennifer has a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Rice University and a Master's of Business Administration from Duke University. Welcome, Jennifer. It's all yours.
Thanks, Paul, for the kind introduction, and thanks, Harry, for having me here today. As Paul said, I am here on behalf of MISO, which is the Independent System Operator / Reliability or Regional Transmission Organization that really covers a slice down. I would describe it as the middle of the country. So our footprint or our region ranges from Manitoba up in Canada, kind of down through the middle of the country, through the Gulf Coast. And I would describe our overall job as taking the resource decisions and plans that the states and regulators and utilities have and making those work together in a reliable way at the lowest cost possible. And so we do that in a couple of ways that all probably touch the life cycle of any resource type in various ways. We oversee the reliability of the high voltage transmission system. So we have real-time operations doing that every minute of every day. We operate a wholesale electric market. So setting those wholesale electricity prices for the region. We do regional transmission planning. And when I say regional, I think I'm using it in a little different scope than what Josh was mentioning. So that could mean really for any larger part of the MISO area up to the full MISO area. And then probably most specific to what we're talking about today, we work on the interconnection of new resources through that interconnection process that I think Josh also referenced. Generally, when we think about grid interconnection, from that point of interconnection, we're really focused on what is the reliability impact of having that new generation, whatever it is, that's attaching to that transmission system, and determining what additional transmission upgrades may be required to ensure that ongoing reliability that's really set in line with federal standards. When we do that, we call it an interconnection queue. It's not quite a line anymore like it used to be. It used to be one at a time. Today, we'll look at groups of new plants that are looking to come online and study those as a group in their entirety. And part of that is to get to some of this lower cost option. So rather than everybody making a connection one-off, there's an opportunity for new generating plants, and which could be of different types, different fuel sources, to really come together and think about what that group of plants together needs as a transmission solution. The other thing I will just note before I turn it over to the next speaker is I did see a question that was about the cost of the projects, and ultimately the state is who is determining the retail rates and the retail impacts. I can tell you though that from a wholesale perspective, for MISO, we do also have rules that govern who pays for those transmission interconnections. And those rules today are that it is the interconnection customer who largely bears that direct cost of that interconnection, of the transmission that's identified through that MISO process. So that's just a little bit of an overview of MISO's role in this process and how we would interact with offshore wind. So for now, I'll leave it there and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Before we get on to Andrew, I'm going to throw out one question, not for you to answer right now, but for the whole panel to think about in connection with your final remarks. And that is, what principles should guide the answer to the following question for these, both the transmission costs and the interconnection costs? And that is, how should the cost of getting offshore and wind energy to customers be allocated among market participants and or other stakeholders? So if the panelists would just sort of keep that in the back of their mind, this is one I'd like to try to address later on when the panelists are finished giving their initial presentations. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Our next presenter will be Andrew Tusillo. Andrew currently serves as the Chief of Staff to President Helena Moreno of the City Council of New Orleans. Excuse me, and has held that position for over 3 years. Among the many and varied responsibilities in that position, Andrew develops and manages policy and administration of the City Council's Utility Regulatory Committee, which is no small job. He participates in setting the policy agenda, managing issues dockets, and crafting strategy to effectuate the City Council's responsibility to set rates pursue climate action, and regulate the electric utility operations in the city. Andrew has previously served as senior advisor to former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, was chief of staff at the Louisiana Department of Health, and served as chief of staff and legislative aide to State Senator Karen Carter Peterson. Andrew was awarded a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Boston College and is a graduate of the Tulane University School of Law. I'm very pleased to present Andrew, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Professor. I actually, as well as Harry, I was also a student of yours many, many years ago. Thank you for having me, everybody. I'm going to try to share my screen if I can do so successfully. I'm going to speak generally, as Professor Zimmering mentioned, my role in the Council Utilities Chief's Office as Chief of Staff. So we manage, we have a small public service commission in essence. The City of New Orleans, of course, is separate from the rest of the state. We're, as usual, different. We manage and regulate Entry New Orleans, the utility that serves New Orleans East and West Banks now. And we have kind of a similar but much smaller array of resources to regulate, just like the Public Service Commission. So if I can, I'll try to share my screen and do if everyone can see that. Is that visible to everyone?
It is not to me, not yet.
Let me see if I can do a great job of pressing these buttons. All right, let's see if I can do this. All right, yeah, let's see if I can do a good job of switching here. Maybe not. Maybe not. I'm sorry, Harry, I don't want
to share screen at the bottom and then.
Yeah, I'm sharing it, but it's not allowing me to go to my everything on your screen. Yeah, start broadcast. Okay. All right, now should be sharing. And if everyone can see this now.
Looks great.
Great. And you can see the proposed, you can see my first page here?
Yes.
Perfect. So I wanted to talk a little bit about today, the reason that we're here and why I've been invited, I think, is New Orleans will be hopefully one of the premier consumers of renewable electricity in South Louisiana. We've recently passed the Gulf South's first renewable portfolio standard, which is a standard that requires Entergy New Orleans to reach carbon, become carbon free by 2050 and net zero carbon by 2040, which means an exchange of Entergy New Orleans resource fleet from a carbon intensity to zero in a relatively short amount of time. So, and please stop me if you all can't see something, but I should be on the second page here. And this gives you a little overview of the RCPS. We have a standard that requires 100% carbon free by 2050. We are technology agnostic. We're using a variety of technologies to reach that standard, to reach that goal. It will most likely be renewable and nuclear heavy, although there are some other opportunities there. So we will be in search of and in need of a significant amount of renewable and carbon-free power, obviously wind being an exceptional opportunity in that regard. Just if everyone can see this little graph, you can kind of see our progress. Everyone can see this graph. It gives us a sense of where we start and where we need to be by 2050. You can see it's a rather rapid ramp after 2030. And that has to do with the nature of our Entergy New Orleans resource mix. as everyone can see here, and this is just a little bit about a year old, but gives a sense right now of where our resource mix stands. And most significantly, the largest resource mix we have in there, the largest piece of that resource mix, the natural gas part of that CCGT, which is we own a large a natural gas fired plant in Arkansas, and that's set to retire in around the 2030s area. So we will need a significant replacement of baseload power, and so we'll need to make significant investments to do so in order to serve the needs of the residents and businesses of the city of New Orleans. This kind of speaks to the speed at which we are intending to transition to carbon-free generation. As you can see here, we're among the quickest, the fastest transitions, and this is probably about a year old. So as of a year ago, we have one of the fastest transitions to carbon-free or net zero, and then eventually to carbon-free power generation in the country. It's something that we're very proud of. The New Orleans is leading, one of the leading jurisdictions in the country during this transition. This is a slide that I think probably won't serve much purpose for this group. It just gives a sense of other states and jurisdictions that have standards. Again, not showing us, but we're again one of the fastest, quickest transitions among all the standards. There were some questions I know in the audience about affordability. New Orleans obviously has a high poverty rate. We have a high energy poverty rate because folks have poorly insulated homes. We need to do a significant amount of work with energy efficiency to help folks lower their bills, despite the fact that our retail rates, I think someone said that the Louisiana retail rate is 9.25 or 9.5. We average around 10.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So we are just a little bit higher, but still among the lowest in the country, top 10 lowest in the country rates. But we still have to make a significant and hopefully a significant investment. So we need to make sure that this is going to be a fair and just transition. And that's going to be important that people can afford this transition. And our plan makes it possible that we can both transition, but also do so at a way in which it does not increase the rates for the folks that live in New Orleans significantly. Just gives a quick sense of where we need to go and how fast. As y'all can see, in the 2032 time period, there's a significant need for replacement of resources. So as these new resources, hopefully with offshore wind, and of course, I think with a significant amount of solar that's in the MISO queue, we're going to need to be significant consumers. Obviously, with the utilization percentages, we can't just replace the 500 or 600 megawatts that we're going to lose one-to-one. We're going to need to be looking for projects that exceed that amount, and obviously add some storage as well in order to load shift and be able to firm up that capacity, because the firm capacity of natural gas will be leaving our resource mix. This just gives a sense for how we are incentivizing Energy New Orleans, which of course has agreed and is making this transition. They'll make Energy New Orleans the fastest transitioning operating company in the Energy family as of now. I spoke about affordability, and then of course there's some accountability. We're making sure that this is a mandate, so the utility will be held to account to make sure that this transition occurs. So again, this will incentivize our need to consume renewable power. So with that, I'm going to sort of come back here. I'm going to try to turn off my screen, maybe come back to the group. And I think I hope that technology worked. And I'm happy to answer questions, but I think I'm sure everyone else would like to sort of present. I'm happy to answer questions at the end. Appreciate the time, y'all.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Next up is going to be James Cotter. And I'm sure there will be a whole lot of questions, Andrew, particularly about the affordability, particularly because of the area in the country in which we live, and some of the poorest states are located here who may be impacted. But we'll get back to that when we finish up the presentations. James, are you there?
Yes. Good morning.
Excellent. James Cotter is our next presenter. James is the General Manager, Offshore Wind Americas at Shell. He brings more than 15 years of experience in offshore renewables and power to his current role. His background includes offshore and onshore wind operations, execution and development alongside integration with trading, mergers and acquisitions, risk management, and business development. He started his career in 2000 in small startup companies, moving into power in 2004 and renewables shortly after that. James has worked through the full life cycle of renewables, renewable operating portfolios of onshore and offshore assets, working within project organizations, taking commissioning responsibility through to the early phase development of large lease areas. James holds a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from the University of York, and it's all yours.
Fantastic. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I think everyone can feel a bit safer that I've never used chemistry so far. So I'll stick with renewables. So I think it's clear that the world needs to move to a cleaner energy system if we're to meet our growing energy demand while tackling climate change. Shell has set a target to be net zero emissions business by 2050 or sooner, in step with society and our customers. We aim to be a major provider of renewable low carbon energy. We want to find ways of helping our customers, whether they're households or businesses, to switch to these options through renewable and low carbon energy and decarbonisation services. And I think that's key. But I really believe that the integrated energy company of the future will be focused not on optimizing single assets or maximizing electron generation, but on delivering the right vector of energy to the right place at the right time. We'll all definitely have a different relationship with energy to that which we have today. As you'd expect me to say, offshore wind is one important element that can be combined with onshore generation, solar, onshore wind, dispatchable resources, storage, hydrogen, ammonia, traditional fuels, to achieve an integrated energy basin that can satiate our customer needs and desires. Our current offshore wind portfolio is in the Northeast and progressing well, but it has challenges that the industry is facing, and I think key for today's discussion, transmission access and ensuring long-term view to system integration is front and center. So what's important is how offshore wind can become the anchor investment that enables the energy basin concept. And we're focusing on regions that have that potential, like the Gulf of Mexico. Currently, it's a heartland of Shell energy production and manufacturing businesses. And I think it's important, that areas, when they are opened up for leases, are done so not simply by looking at the power market and connections, but the overall energy system potential and existing energy infrastructure that we can use. The system approach of the right vector of energy to the right place at the right time allows us all and Shell to build on existing offshore production know-how, supply chain infrastructure, to deliver the business with lower development costs potentially and carbon intensity, partly through utilizing what's already there, what we have skills in, and what exists, and not just focusing on that we're here to create electrons. So this approach will require ongoing and deeper collaboration between federal, state governments, region utilities, and generators like Shell on the energy transition pathway for Louisiana. For instance, working in collaboration with Entergy and other IOCs in the region that can help us determine feasibility of co-location of transmission or distribution lines through existing oil and gas pipeline rights of way, which can potentially reduce greenfield developments, land acquisition costs, and minimize impacts with and around permitting in what are sensitive coastal environments. I think Josh mentioned earlier, we shouldn't just think about the fact that transmission is a given. There are only a certain number of landfalls or places where it's appropriate to have a landfall. Again, delivering reliable renewable energy at competitive prices for ratepayers will require a lot of coordinated planning rather than short-term project by project approach. If you design a system with the end in mind, it'll always be more efficient. The temptation may be to go with a cheaper solution that works on the initial projects that can drive the price to ratepayers up in the future. So, the goal isn't about just delivering offshore wind, but how do we deliver a cost-effective energy system based upon integrated energy basin concept? And I guess it's easy to say that, and it's also easy to say, what will it take to deliver the energy system of the future that we all need? And again, it's a relatively simple but quite daunting answer. I think, to really move past single asset investment, single transmission investment, we need collaboration, imagination, creativity, desire, and a lot of things to line up. And it will need strong and unyielding leadership from federal agencies, state, like we see here today, companies such as Shell, and also to line with public desire. If we don't have a pull and a need, it will be much more difficult to achieve. So I think in summary, the challenge for us all is not to focus on single individual projects or a single energy vector like electron, but how do we create that different system of energy delivery enabled by an anchor investment in offshore wind and transmission that on a planned and coordinated approach can help us to decarbonize our system cost effectively to the ratepayer. So in summary, I think the energy system is changing. I think today is a great example. I think it's changing fast, and where there's change, there's an opportunity, and the opportunity we should look at as the long-term objectives and not how can we get to a very quick short-term win. This is about a long-term change in behavior. So really looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, James. Appreciate that. Next up will be Brandon Frye. Brandon serves as the Louisiana Public Service Commission's Executive Secretary, a position he has held since December of 2017. He's been employed with the Louisiana Commission since April of '99, starting as a staff attorney. From 2012 through 2018, Brandon served as the Commission's Executive Counsel, acting as lead counsel in all appellate matters, both federal and state, and advising the commissioners and the Commission's Executive Secretary on legal matters affecting the Commission, as well as representing the Commission in matters before the federal agencies, including the FERC, as well as state agencies. As Executive Secretary, Brandon heads the Commission staff, interacts with the commissioners, regulated utilities, the general public, and governmental agencies, including the Louisiana legislature. Prior to working for the Commission, Brandon received a BA in 1994 and a JD in 1997, both from Louisiana State University, and served as judicial clerk for the 26th Judicial District Court, parishes of Bossier and Webster. Full disclosure, Brandon is my client. And it will be fun asking him questions, which is usually works in the opposite direction. But in any event, Brandon Frye, it's all yours.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Harry, for having me on the panel. I'm going to basically do like any smart lawyer does and not reinvent the wheel. So I'm going to completely copy verbatim Paul's disclosure and disclaimer statement he made. I didn't write it all down, but these are my thoughts, not the Commission's thoughts. About the Commission. The Commission are the ultimate decision makers. And they are a key or possibly the key player in this whole process. And why do I say that? This is going to be boring for some of you on this panel, but those listening may not know this. The Louisiana Commission is a constitutionally created agency to set with the authority to regulate public utilities. And the 5 elected commissioners are those decision makers. What's unique about that? Well, 48 other states have a legislatively created commission. There's one other state that has a constitutionally created commission, that being Arizona. They call it something different, same functions. And also the large majority are appointed commissioners. We are elected, so we operate independently of the legislature. In fact, I've had the pleasure or honor or whatever else you want to call it of actually suing the legislature on multiple occasions for attempting to usurp that jurisdiction. So we need to be mindful of that when we talk about legislative goals and other things. That what would typically be a legislative function in every other state is a PSC function, with some exceptions. Under that constitutional authority, we don't regulate municipally owned or operated utilities. There's a decent number. I'm looking at a map across my conference room, but the largest would be the city of Lafayette, which owns and operates its own distribution system and has some small generation assets. And then the big exception that Andrew talked about, the city of New Orleans, who regulates the energy system there. What the commission's role would ultimately be in that any power purchase agreement or purchase power agreement, whichever way you want to say it, from a regulated utility or by a regulated utility from a wholesale provider, which arguably these wind providers would be, has to be certified by the commission. And when the commission certifies such a project, it's essentially looking that it was prudent. There's a couple of commission general orders. Those familiar with us know what those are. They are law. The ones particularly important here are the commission's September 20th, 1983 general order, or generically the 83 order that everyone who practices in front of us refers to it as, which was modified in October of 2008. But that essentially sets forth the certification process for any PPA that's over 5 megawatts or over a year. And I would assume these would be long-term PPAs. Those PPAs can come to us in a number of ways, but the two main ways are an unsolicited offer, and in simple terms, if, and I'm going to pick on those on the panel, if Shell approached Energy and said, hey, I've got a deal for you, so many megawatts of wind for X dollars a megawatt hour, Energy is required under our processes to consider that offer. And if they reject it, let us know why they rejected it, or come forward to certify that project with us. The more traditional way is the utilities issue requests for proposals, and those are based looking at their own resource planning, their needs, retirements, et cetera, goals of the commission. They'll issue a robust request for proposal, take bids from potential providers. It could be specific to renewables. It could be specific to a type of renewable. It could be across the board. We've seen more examples of that recently. In fact, we've got some renewable PPAs pending right now from a couple of our utilities, or will soon be filed. Some are restricted to certain types of renewable products. Others are across the board. But again, the ultimate goal in any of those certifications is to determine the actions of the utility were prudent. These processes can be very robust, to put it lightly. Oftentimes they are litigated, and we get a wide range of those involved. The commission staff is a party to all the dockets. While Professor Zemmering was not a teacher of mine, I actually was co-counsel with him on a number of certification projects way back in the day. That's probably been 15 years ago now. But you've got the utilities participating. In some instances, if it's a third party and not the utility themselves coming forward with the project, that provider will participate. We've got large industrial groups that participate. We've got commercial user groups who have been more active recently, and lastly, ratepayer groups. And we've got two of those. Well, actually, just one of those. Logan's on here. I don't think we have any large industrial groups represented on this, but they're always involved in those processes as well, and they're looking out for their respective members' interests. And we typically, and more recently here, we've had great collaboration amongst all parties in reaching consensus on stipulations in these proceedings. I do want to touch on something. There was a question earlier, and I saw some follow-up questions. And I guess it was 2 weeks ago when BOEM had the call, the webinar, there was a presentation from the Renewable Energy Lab that spoke about the potential price per megawatt hour of wind farms in the Gulf. And I want to focus on those prices because I think that's the thing everyone's got to talk about and explain exactly what that is. But the prices I heard were $73 to $81 a megawatt hour for wind in the Gulf. That's simple terms, that's 7.3 to 8.1 cents a kilowatt hour. And I talked about our rates in Louisiana being 9.4. Those aren't apples to apples. And here's why I say that. The question I raised to the BOEM panelists was, does that include the price of transmission? And I was pretty sure I knew the answer, and the answer was no. And that is not insignificant. I haven't heard anyone say what transmission is going to cost, but I know what transmission, well, I'm going to kick that to Jonathan when he comes up. He can tell us how much transmission costs on land and existing corridors. Building transmission 20 or 30 miles offshore to interconnect with the grid, which in most instances is another 20 to 30 miles on land at a minimum. And we saw that with the rebuilds from the hurricanes, is not an insignificant cost. And what does it do to that $73 to $81 a megawatt hour? Does it double it? I don't know, but it's not insignificant. But again, those are wholesale rates. That 9.4 cents I was talking about and 18 cents, those are retail rates. So that's not just the cost of wholesale power in that 9.4, which is what this 8.1 and 7.3 is. That's everything. That's the distribution lines. That's the existing transmission lines. That's the existing generation. That's billing and collection. That's everything wrapped into that rate. And I think the best way to look at it is, I'll give a shout out to Jennifer and MISO. For those of you who don't have it, and this is just a electric geek like myself, MISO has a fantastic app for smartphones that shows the current load profile, and what they call the locational marginal energy cost, or LMP, and it does it by zones. And essentially what that is, and I'm simplifying it, so Paul or Jennifer can correct me if I'm making it sound too simple, but that's essentially the wholesale price, what it's trading at this specific time. And right now in Louisiana, at the Louisiana hub, it's $30.68 a megawatt. So keep that cost in mind, what wholesale power is selling for right now when you talk about this 73 to 81, which does not include transmission, and how are we going to get those costs down. And I'm sure I raised a lot of questions with that, but I'll leave it there, and I'm sure we can circle back.
Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate it. Next is Jonathan Berg. Sorry, Jonathan. I've known you long enough that I should know the pronunciation of your name. Jonathan is the Director of Resource Planning and Market Operations for Entergy Louisiana, LLC. In that position, he's responsible for managing Entergy Louisiana's planning for fuel, generation, transmission, and wholesale power activities. Jonathan began his career at Entergy in 2002 as an engineer at the 9 Mile Power Station in Westwego, Louisiana. Jonathan left Entergy to obtain a law degree and practiced commercial litigation for several years in New Orleans. He then saw the light and returned to Entergy in 2011. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from LSU and a Juris Doctor degree with honors from Loyola University College of Law in New Orleans. I'm pleased to present Jonathan Berg.
Thanks, Paul. And can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. As Paul mentioned, I am responsible for resource planning for Entergy Louisiana and the more than 1 million customers that we serve in Louisiana. For those, I think most people are familiar with our service area, but for those not so familiar, we cover a large portion of Louisiana, and with a large part of that service area covering the Gulf, stretching from the furthest parts southeast to the furthest parts southwest of the state. Brandon went into a lot of detail about the rules that we follow in our resource planning effort at the commission, in coordination with his staff and the stakeholders, the many stakeholders involved in that process, including Logan, who you'll hear from in a second. But as we are operating under those rules and as we are developing our resource portfolio, we're guided by 3 primary objectives: affordability, reliability, and environmental stewardship. And we balance all of those as we look to mitigate risk for our customers. And if we think about those 3 key objectives and how that relates to offshore wind, I'll start with environmental stewardship. Obviously, it fits the bill there. It's known that Entergy has announced its intent to achieve net zero by 2050, a pathway we share with many of our customers. And offshore wind would certainly support the path towards that net zero commitment along for ourselves and our customers. In terms of reliability, as a general matter, offshore wind would obviously support our capacity needs, but also just in terms of location. It's generally well located from a reliability point of view. Um, Generally speaking, power on the transmission system flows from north to south. We have load pockets in Louisiana that many have heard of in the south and the southeast portion of the state, and WOTAB in the western portion of the state. And those are planning constrained regions because of their geography, to the east, to the west, and most notably to the south. Having a resource that traditionally was unavailable to the south of that area would be a beneficial resource in terms of reliability for the region. But then, of course, you know, that final planning principle, I think, is or planning objective is the one that we find most challenging under current circumstances with offshore wind, and that's affordability. In the current environment, as we look at the cost of offshore wind, and Brandon touched on some of the numbers, there are alternatives out there currently available to us that are more favorable economically, most notably solar. And, you know, as Brandon touched on, we first have the challenge of the cost of the resource itself, given the wind profiles in the Gulf and the cost to construct the turbines. And second, and important, obviously, to the discussion is the interconnection cost. And that's the transmission costs Brandon was touching on. And, you know, we all think about the cost to get the power to the coastline and the transmission costs associated with that. But in large part, we don't have a large transmission system sitting at that coastline. In some areas we do, certainly in the southeastern tips of our service area, there are transmission lines stretching out into the Gulf. But for the most part, the bulk of the transmission system is still inland from the coast. And so you got to think to get to the coast and then to the transmission system, and looking for the easiest ways to get there. Paul, you mentioned, you know, cost allocation being part of that discussion. Once we get over this affordability issue, which is a challenging issue for us, and I know we're all working on trying to crack that nut, but that is a nut to crack right now. And if you think about cost allocation, I think, you know, as with any cost allocation, it comes down to benefits. And I think it really becomes a kind of resource specific discussion at that point, who is benefiting from the resource. And as we will get to wind at some point, whether it be in Entergy Louisiana service territory or in MISO South in general, once we figure out that affordability angle, determining that cost allocation, of course, is important. So overall, you know, I think we have a lot of challenges in front of us as far as our rate structure and cost of wind and offshore wind overall. But in many other respects, offshore wind would provide a lot of benefit to customers if we can find an affordable way to get it here.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yep.
All right, last but not least, Logan Atkinson Burke. Our next presenter is Logan Atkinson Burke. Logan is the executive director of the Alliance for Affordable Energy and has held that position for the past 4 years. She has been with the Alliance all told since 2013. The Alliance for Affordable Energy is an organization dedicated to ensuring fair, affordable, and environmentally responsible energy policies for all Louisiana energy consumers. The Alliance is an active participant in rate cases and rulemakings before both the Louisiana Public Service Commission and the New Orleans City Council. Those proceedings include the development of clean portfolio standards, integrated resource planning policy, energy efficiency programs, and renewable energy rulemakings. Logan currently serves on the Governor's Climate Initiative Task Force, and she has authored numerous papers. She's a graduate of Vassar College. I'm very pleased to introduce Logan Atkinson Burke. It's all yours, Logan.
Thank you so much.
It's 10 o'clock.
Oh, you caught me. And my computer telling me what time it is. I also want to say, while I did not generally attend Tulane Law, I did attend Professor Zimmering's course. And so thanks to his tutelage, we have all come a long way. thank you also for the introduction to what the Alliance does. We serve and have served since 1985 as a consumer advocate looking out specifically for residential utility consumers in Louisiana. 46 states actually have either an office or an acknowledged People's Council. Sometimes even it's the Attorney General. Louisiana does not have this. And so the Alliance has served in that position since the mid-80s. And as Professor Zimmering referred to, we get involved at the Public Service Commission and the New Orleans City Council. So a lot of this conversation about affordability is right in our wheelhouse. It is true that Louisiana has some of the lowest rates and has historically had these very low rates, but that does not mean that we have bills that people can afford in Louisiana. Louisiana has some of the highest energy burdens, and that means as a result of the intersection of high energy waste and usage, Louisianans use about 30% more electricity per household than the average American. Add that to our significant poverty rates. There are an awful lot of folks who struggle with current utility bills in Louisiana. Around 150,000 Louisianans paid upwards of 22% of their income on home energy bills last year. So just thinking about where we are right now in terms of our bills and where we're going and what some of the policies need to be as a package, as a portfolio to deal with that affordability crisis. So the Alliance is interested in finding the root cause of these affordability problems and solving them from that perspective. But we recognize that affordability is also more than the bill that we're paying. It's also what is Louisiana paying in terms of the impacts of climate change? What are we paying in terms of our health when we have a poor air quality day, as we did last week, resulting from ground level ozone from combusting fossil fuels? These are things that we're dealing with not just as the climate is warming, but we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis as a result of the traditional energy resources. So we recognize that extreme heat, humidity, and cold, which we are experiencing more and more, are driving increased energy costs already. Not to mention the big costs of climate change to our energy systems. The storms that Louisiana has experienced just in about 6 months' time, including the hurricanes and the winter storms of the last year, are putting some significant pressure on folks' bills already. Some Louisianans are experiencing about 10% increase on their bills just from 6 months worth of storms. And so recognizing that we have to turn off the taps, this is a reason it's pointing us to really grappling with the climate crisis and recognizing that while even if we were to switch to full renewables and energy efficiency and decarbonization tomorrow, we've got some baked in costs that we're going to have to deal with going forward. But also recognizing we need to make this transition to protect our coast and our people and our culture. But the great news is that renewable costs have been falling. We were hearing a bit earlier about the costs that BOEM was reporting from their February 2020 report on Gulf of Mexico wind. Just looking at those costs that were based on 2016 data and looking forward, I'm going to show in just a few minutes a trend line that the NREL annual technology baseline is projecting for the costs of offshore wind, which should give us all some excitement. But also just comparing, looking at frankly, the drop off in the costs of historic renewables over the last decade. Solar fell by 90% between 2009 and 2020. and onshore wind fell by 70%. And those are unsubsidized costs that are falling so precipitously. And so we really need to be thinking about how developing policies to move those things forward in the way that onshore wind and solar have done are going to be part of this solution. So we also recognize that offshore wind is not going to be the first foray into renewables for Louisiana, and it mustn't be. Solar onshore in Louisiana is a great opportunity for resources right now, but we do know that it takes a decade or so to develop some of these projects, not just to put the steel in the ground, but the policy, the application process and so forth, alongside, of course, the longer scale transmission project development. So recognizing that none of this is going to happen overnight, we do need to start with the kinds of resources that we know are really cheap right now to help reduce folks' bills, including, of course, energy efficiency, which is our common favorite resource, if you will. We also know, as I mentioned, that Louisiana is already experiencing some of these increased costs on our bills as a result of hurricanes and other kinds of climate-fueled risks. And so we need to be thinking about what are the things that we can do to develop these kinds of resources, not only in terms of our electric, our economy associated with our current electric bills, but are putting people back to work. We recognize that Louisiana is already an anchor in a supply chain for offshore wind in other parts of the country. And we know that a lot of the jobs that the traditional energy sectors have supported, those being steel workers and construction and electricians, a lot of that work, those kinds of jobs will be transferable to an offshore wind and, of course, transmission build out economy that we're going to need. So we know that we have to move forward on no regret solutions and recognize that offshore wind does work. It is a technology that is viable. It's obviously viable enough in the Atlantic coast now for folks to be moving forward on it. And we know that it will be viable in the future in the Gulf of Mexico. Obviously, we are going to need to be part of that national supply chain and not basically let other states eat our lunch on that opportunity. But that means that we can't just kick this can down the road and say we're not going to be a part of this transformation of our energy sector. So I wanted to show just really quickly, and I will do my best to share my screen. Let's see. Very quickly. So can you see clearly that levelized cost of energy comparison? I just show a slide.
So it's showing up with your notes and the next slide.
Okay, let me do it in a different way then. Let me share my screen. This one. I apologize. Thank you for your grace. And is that better?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, great. So this is from Lazard. They do a national survey every year of the costs of renewables as compared to traditional styles of generation. And you can see that really precipitous drop in the cost of solar and wind. And we need to be thinking about what that means in terms of looking forward at other renewables. So I wanted to show you this next slide from the National Renewable Energy Labs annual technology baseline, which shows, again, a precipitous drop in the cost of offshore wind. This does not include the now existing 30% investment tax credit that was voted in December of 2020. And so the NREL ATB of 2020, which this represents, shows an incredible drop in the cost of offshore wind. And I've compared that here to the cost of a high capacity factor natural gas CCGT turbine that includes carbon capture, sequestration, and utilization. And the reason I've done that is within the governor's climate task force, there's a lot of conversation about what some of the solutions to a carbon-free future looks like, and a lot of conversation around the idea of carbon capture. Well, we know that so far there haven't been any really successful large at-scale carbon capture projects that have been rolled out in the country. But right now, our federal labs are showing us that even with a currently low projected cost for CCGT with carbon capture, by 2030, the offshore wind costs should plummet past that. And so just thinking about what that means in terms of long-term planning, whoopsie daisy, I'm trying to stop my share. And that might be a struggle. There we go. So I just want to have us be thinking about how Louisiana can be part of this transition now, and thinking about our future and what is best for our coast and for our people. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Logan. Before we open this up for questions, there's one more set of questions I would like the panel to be thinking about, and we'll circle back to it later on. And I guess this is directed to everybody except Andrew and Brandon, and that is, what do the stakeholders in the industry want from state regulators? Stated a little bit differently and maybe a little bit more negatively, what don't they want state regulators doing that might interfere is too strong a word, but present some hurdles to the development in the Gulf? Now we can circle back to that question and the one I asked previously when Jennifer was speaking regarding who's going to pay, who should pay for the transmission. We can circle back to those a little bit later. There was just one other clarifying thing I wanted to do, if I may, Logan, and that is when you mentioned the hurricanes and the winter storm, Louisiana was just hammered last summer by Laura, Delta, and Zeta. And then Winter Storm Uri came around, which you all probably remember the Texas experience more than anything else. But it impacted Louisiana in two major ways. Number one, there's about just shy of $2.5 billion worth of damage that was done as a result of those four storms in Louisiana, which number was exacerbated from what it would have been because the repair and restoration was taking place in a COVID environment where you had to have people segregated. You couldn't have four linemen sleeping in one bedroom and all those kind of things. And secondly, because of the spike in fuel costs, particularly Clico Power, Entergy Louisiana, and Entergy New Orleans paid a lot more for fuel, and those dollar for dollar costs are being flowed back through the fuel adjustment clauses of those companies. All right, I'll stop there. Harry, I'm going to turn it back to you for a moment to see what the questions look like in the queue.
All right, thank you. Yeah, we have a few lined up. We have one that says, thanks for the presentation. In the case of regional transmission, would associated costs be divided between project developers, or would this be covered by the state? I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that one.
I think the short answer is it depends on who is asking for that project to exist. it would be under a right of way, a regional line would be, at least for the offshore context, would be proposed by a developer for that specific line. So who pays for it would be sort of negotiated among the parties that would be using it, and potentially the state. The state could also commission something along those lines. But people might have more detail than I do.
and maybe put another way of what are some examples in other, for other developments or other projects. But go ahead, Logan.
Well, I just want to clarify something about when the question is asked if the state would pay. The state of Louisiana does not pay for transmission. And it's unusual for any government, whether it be state or federal, to pay for transmission. These kinds of infrastructures are always paid for by the ratepayers and those off-takers. And so thinking, though, about what it means if the US is going to make the kinds of transitions over to the renewables that we need, we are going to need significant investments in our transmission infrastructure. And so thinking what that means, not only from potentially the state level, but certainly the federal level, and looking at the kinds of programs that the current administration is considering in terms of that sort of infrastructure is worth considering. We know that this isn't a technology problem, really, it's a policy concern. And so, but as we're thinking, with the current setup, from our perspective, the beneficiary is the one who ought to pay for the transmission.
Gotcha. And then great point. And then also the nuance, the difference between, end user paying versus financing a project on the front end in the build out. We have a question for Josh. At the BOEM website, there is lease and grant information, but the only grants discussed are rights of way grants. Will BOEM be establishing any grants in 2021, 2022 for the demonstration of high elevation wind energy systems? And there's a link in the Q&A. The obvious benefits in those are, one, winds are many times faster at high elevations, and two, birds in general don't fly that high.
So any sort of project would require a lease of some degree. So they would either need to acquire a lease through a lease sale, or there's an option for sort of a limited lease for technology testing or something along those lines, or a research lease process that where a state or research entity is involved with that process. And so a project like that would have to be proposed to BOEM through one of those mechanisms. And as far as I know, we haven't received an application for one yet. So, I'm not saying it couldn't happen in the future, but I don't think we have plans at this stage.
Gotcha. Thank you. We have a question from David Rogers. Power flows from MISO North to MISO South were constrained while attempting to respond to outages in last February's freeze event. As MISO looks to improve reliability in MISO South and promote a lower carbon future, wouldn't it make sense to include in future transmission upgrades investment to link offshore wind to greater MISO South versus demanding developers bear that cost?
I can start. That sounds like Paul's earlier question, maybe phrased with a hypothesis of an answer, because that is really the question about who should pay for all of this transmission ultimately. And I do not have an answer to that, but I can tell you the discussions that we have at MISO with all of the stakeholders, and they largely fall, I would say, into two camps, all of which, by the way, to get to Logan's idea earlier, ultimately it's the ratepayer who's paying. But the debate and the question is it better for the developer to bear the cost and then direct that cost to the off-takers of that power? Or is it better to think about it on a more beneficiary-based approach. So who is benefiting from the integration of the new power, lower cost, energy, whatever your benefits might be, avoided other costs, and address it more directly that way, or a hybrid of those things. So I don't know that that's not an answer to what is the right answer. I think ultimately the right answer is the one everybody can live with. But that is certainly the exact debate that goes on as we talk about who should pay for transmission.
I think if I could add, the really interesting question is, what is the system looking to achieve, and how much power do you want to integrate in the longer term? Because if you ask developers to pay, and the developers are looking at individual projects are there to survive in their own right. So they won't necessarily make choices on where they're routing their cable, where they're connecting, and how they're connecting, which works in the most cost-effective way for the ratepayer over the entire aim or target. So the most important part is to say, who is the most interested party to be able to integrate the levels of volumes of power that we want to achieve over the next 20 years? And what does that system look like? And how do we therefore control the behavior of the initial projects to make sure it's not harder, more difficult, or we accidentally increase the costs having cheaper projects first? And we do see that in the East Coast areas as well, where there is benefit to holding queue positions, for example, earlier, even if you don't have a project offshore, and then the projects may or may not win the PPAs and the offtakes, which could drive different costs to the ratepayer. So I think the really hard part is saying, how much do we want to integrate, over what period, and what's the most cost-effective way to the ratepayer to do that, and then allow the developers to work within that framework. Because you leave it to individual projects, and they tend to do what's best for themselves.
Thanks, James. And Jennifer, we have another question for Jonathan. Have you thought about how to bring offshore wind from the coast? Most load centers are further inland, upgrading existing coastal lines, new subsea lines through ship channels or passes. And you mentioned kind of the Entergy's existing transmission capacity and layout. Perhaps maybe elaborating a little bit on the state of it and where exactly, how far south it goes and where.
Yeah, sure. So, I think in general terms of, exacts on how we interconnect offshore wind into our system, we're not at that point yet. And really kind of, as we get into more specifics and individual projects, kind of that becomes a targeted discussion. But, there are certain areas of our system, particularly if you look, extreme parts of Southeast Louisiana, the Port Fourchon area and whatnot, that do extend, our system does extend pretty far out into the Gulf, but at that point, it's really individual lines, right? And it's not your integrated bulk electric system like you would see as you get further up north into the New Orleans area and west to the Lake Charles area, where you really have how we traditionally build our transmission system, which is, with redundant and backup feeds, and really what you think of as the bulk electric system. And you can kind of get into a map and look at the system in general, but I think in general terms, you're looking at 30 miles or so to get from the coast to the bulk electric system. But there are certain areas that are developed a little bit, south of that and bleeding into the Gulf a bit more. And getting there, that, let's say that last 30 miles, is obviously some of the toughest terrain. And as we do have projects that transmission projects existing that do extend out into that marsh area. And we have seen the cost of those transmission build-outs to be the highest cost transmission build-outs on our system, just because, foundations, access and whatnot. And of course, and we've touched on it, those lines themselves sit in pretty, risk-prone areas. And we saw it in Hurricane Zeta. We had a line going down there that was pretty much destroyed as a result of that hurricane. So the cost, not only because of the terrain, but of what you have to build to sustain, category 3 to 5 hurricanes, can become costly to get from the shoreline to our bulk electric system, and that 30 miles, give or take, can be rather expensive transmission build out.
Thanks, Jonathan. We have a question from Laura McComb. Given the complexity of offshore wind development with all the stakeholders and policy requirements, what is the anticipated time frame for an offshore project from inception to execution? With Logan's graph of decreased cost of offshore wind over time, where will we be, I guess, on that cost curve and how it's bending down? Thanks for the participants. Very good info.
So I think I can have a first stab as a developer.
Please.
So I think two things to begin with on timescale. I think Louisiana, the Gulf of Mexico, has some real unique qualities that other areas that look in offshore wind in the US just don't have. I mean, the fact that we're looking to potentially permit offshore wind farm where there is already energy infrastructure, people are used to that energy infrastructure, we can potentially co-locate, through their rights of ways, that can really add advantage. And then secondarily, for the cost reduction Logan was talking about, I mean, the supply chain here in the Gulf of Mexico and the effect they can have with the innovation to bring that cost reduction down, if we can get the industry moving and the focus on it, could be transformative. So I think, from Josh, and you can chip in, that obviously the permitting process does take time. And what's really important is we permit it in a responsible way, and make sure that the developments are appropriate. So from the lease acquisition towards kind of commercial operations can really range anywhere between 5 and 8 years. I think the really important part is, how do you enable the industry to start working it and give the certainty to the industry, but also use the inherent advantage. Hydrogen, for example, is a real vector that could make a difference in the Gulf of Mexico, because effectively we've got pipelines that are coming onshore. It could be potential that offshore wind could be hybrid, and we can create offshore hydrogen that goes into existing infrastructure, as well as onshore lines that go to our hydrogen production for some of our upstream assets. So, potentially that lends to an acceleration. But first and foremost, we have to be the responsible development and the responsible industry and go through the permitting and siting process effectively.
Yeah, and
Harry, I'm sorry, go ahead, Josh.
And I was just going to follow up that the first step would be the designation of wind energy areas and the eventual lease sale process, which would involve a proposed sale notice that would delineate exactly what BOEM was looking to offer on lease. And that has happened on the East Coast, but it has not happened in the Gulf. As many of you may have been involved with the Renewable Energy Task Force that we put on, was it a week ago now? Seems longer, but but yeah, that started that sort of that discussion on how that could happen in the Gulf. So that's just the thought process there. Yeah.
Thanks, Josh. I do see Logan has her hand raised, and then Paul hop in.
Okay.
Yeah, just really briefly to connect something that James said and one of Paul's questions about what is it that people want. The certainty piece is a big deal. And one of the keys to certainty for a new, frankly, a new economy, new kinds of technology are requirements. And in other parts of the country, we've seen things like renewable portfolio standards provide that certainty to new industry to build out and make these kinds of plans. We know that those kinds of policies, renewable portfolio standards, provide a pathway to market transformation. And so just thinking about what I'm hearing, for example, from a lot of the folks that I work with and speak to, something like a renewable or clean portfolio standard is the kind of thing that is not only, a goal for a lot of advocates, clean energy advocates, but also advocates just generally for the future of Louisiana, but also for those who may want to see themselves in this industry and feeling some certainty that there's a mandate, a requirement, a future forward for that in the same way that the New Orleans City Council has provided.
This is just an observation on what the last four commenters have spoken about. It seems to me there's a tension that's existing now for what James was talking about, which I think is absolutely needs to be explored, which is the use of existing infrastructure sitting in the Gulf that's already there, and why not take advantage of it if you could, versus the unique topography and climate in the Gulf, where you know that another tropical storm or hurricane is coming, and how that could tend to make things more expensive to do as compared, for example, to the East Coast, or at least to my way of thinking intuitively, it might add to the cost. And there is obviously a tension between those two. It's just sort of an observation more than anything else. I did want to ask Josh, and you pointed out, and I'm glad you did earlier, that the Block Island wind turbines really were within state waters. But I still wanted to ask what lessons have been learned, both from the construction and getting them in place, and then their operation on a going forward basis, to the extent that you can address those issues.
Sure. Well, from a federal perspective, perhaps the more relevant project would be the one there behind me. There is the CVAL project, which was just put in last summer off the coast of Virginia, and that is the first demonstration project in federal waters. And so, I would say that a lot was learned. Obviously, going through the regulatory process for the first time, there's always things that have to be sort of worked out as you work through the process, both from a federal process, a state process, and developers working in the system as well. So, I think sort of like anything, the more times you go through that, you know what to look out for, you know what to expect, and can sort of direct, comments on designs and things more appropriately. So over time, I would expect the federal process and the regulatory process in general to sort of speed up over time, just from that experience. So I guess that's a fairly broad answer to your question, but I don't know if I can go into high level or very detailed specifics on that.
That's fair. Jennifer, if I might ask the same question, then we can get back to the questions from the folks listening in about the transferability of the interconnection that you've had recently in MISO North and MISO Central of wind to the system, and if there's anything that's transferable to this potential Gulf wind generation.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I think the biggest piece of it is what Brandon and Jonathan both mentioned, is that the amount of transmission upgrades that are needed seems to be surprising. So when we look at those cost curves, like we were looking at earlier, they don't tend to reflect the full cost. So certainly including the transmission piece of it. And our experience has been, and customer experience has been, particularly going into areas where there is not necessarily an existing really robust transmission infrastructure, that there's going to be a lot of investment needed there, in some cases more than the cost of the actual generation itself. So I think that is analogous before you even add on, some of the challenges we were talking about with the weather and the storms and all of those kinds of things. The other one just to think about, which is not necessarily specific to offshore wind specifically. But the other thing is just in general, as you get larger penetrations of renewables, there are operational challenges that you need to think about too. And those come potentially with other infrastructure as well. So whether that is additional transmission, batteries, other types of generation, and then how that all plays into the cost of wholesale power. So I think that's the other learning we've seen, not from a specific interconnection, but as you start to see large amounts of intermittent generation come online, some of those questions start to apply. Then I think that could ultimately be applicable here too, depending on where it went.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before hopping back into the questions, I do have a follow-up. Jonathan, you mentioned that Entergy's existing transmission lines go pretty far south, down south to like Port Fourchon area. I was wondering, and this is for everybody, but is there a cost advantage between upgrading an existing line versus creating building new in a new area and having to acquire new servitudes? I guess it's probably not the same as renovating a house. Maybe cheaper to build new. Is it cheaper to build off of an upgrade existing infrastructure or easier in the permitting where you already have transmission lines?
Yeah, certainly. If you have the right of way, that's a cost that you can avoid if you are upgrading an existing line. And I think to Jennifer's point, the system in general, right, and how it was built out, contemplated that, the flow going down to Port Fourchon was coming from the north. So as you look at it going the other way, the system just needs to be evaluated to see if it can handle it and what those lines may need. But certainly having something existing there that you can upgrade, and some of those facilities have been upgraded in recent times. Just having a line that's capable of being upgraded is obviously cheaper than building a brand new line, most notably because of the right of way, because right of way certainly has costs.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I see Brandon and then James with your hands raised.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, what Jonathan said and your question, Harry, we had a cooperative, an electric cooperative that actually owned some transmission in Southwest Louisiana, whose lines went a little bit further south than Energy's, but they weren't the bulk transmission to get to Jonathan's point. These were to serve individual smaller customers. Being a cooperative, a lot of their rebuild costs are covered through FEMA. And there was one particular line and that crosses the intracoastal. So you're talking a good, if you're looking at a map, the intracoastal basically follows the Cameron Parish, Calcasieu Parish line, and that's about where the bulk transmission stops, a little bit north of there. But their line crossed the intracoastal and had been knocked down by multiple hurricanes. So they were seeking to bore it underneath the intracoastal. And we're just talking 2 or 3 spans. And that project still has not been finalized to the best of my understanding because of the permitting concerns, because of the increased cost to bore just that small section of line in a marsh underground. And that's comparing it to those obviously heightened costs of building pads in the marsh that you would not have on more solid ground. So certainly there are, that's even an existing corridor. It's just trying to transition it from, I guess, to a more hardened infrastructure. There's a lot of pushback in permitting that's causing a lot of delays with that.
Thanks, Brandon. James?
Yeah, no, I think I was going to come back to, is it more cost effective for existing or new? And I think it comes back to, again, it comes to the system planning of how do you plan for your decarbonized energy system? What does that look to? And Jennifer, I totally agree. Intermittency is something that we have to think about, and renewables comes with shape, and it comes with shape that maybe not as controllable as we'd hope. And, that's a fact of it. And for me, the real question is, how do we start planning from that for day one? Because we know, what we know is lower carbon energy probably does come with a level of not plan or dispatchable extra resource. So what that brings you to is the policies and the state structures or the PPA offtake structures that say what we need to be able to do is incentivize the right behavior. If you come to a developer and say, we want to incentivize you to build offshore wind, and here's a lovely structure that comes with that says maximize every electron generated, don't worry about what's going on in the system, that the product of that is that it's harder to manage from a system perspective. So being able to look at a more energy-based concept, and the concept of actually you want to incentivize the developers to help to get the right vector of energy to the right place at the right time, means that we need to be very careful around the tariff arrangements. We need to be very careful about how we segregate different assets. You know, if a developer can come with a way to say, we've got offshore wind, we can combine it with hydrogen and ammonia, and can we look at how the overall energy is performed, you can start to move away from the intermittency problem, and you're putting the solution to the people that can have a little bit more of a say in how that's solved. And also, you know, I'd love to say as a developer, we come up with all the great ideas. In reality, a lot of the great ideas come from the supply chain and working with the supply chain. And again, that's a huge benefit that we have in the Gulf of Mexico. Look at really the operational efficiencies over the last 40 years of operations offshore. I mean, it's, you know, if you compare today with 20 years ago, you wouldn't recognize it. So I think real careful thought about how policy is enacted, how that gets into tariffs, and the behaviors that you're incentivizing from the asset owners is just as key as thinking about how you can enable that capacity to get to the right place.
Thanks, James. So we want to go back to a few questions. I know we're kind of coming up at the top of the hour in about 19 minutes. So want to make sure we get to the overarching questions that our moderator asked. But this one kind of gets to that from David Rogers. Introducing renewable generation isn't easy, and offshore wind will take efforts by utilities, MISO, and the PSC. And I'll add in the City Council of New Orleans to balance costs with lower carbon goals. Echoing Logan's comments, onshore wind in West Texas started out at 6.5 cents in 2012 and is now below 3 cents, with multiple panelists voicing what can impede integration of offshore wind. What are some ways that can overcome these obstacles through innovation? As an example, offshore oil and gas took commitments to go deeper. Why not wind, especially with the new jobs involved? I take it those hands that are raised for Brendan and James are kind of just remaining up. But if you either of you want to hop in.
No, I put it up, and I wanted to focus more on the cost we're seeing on the onshore wind and solar, and again, kind of focus on what we're looking at here. We've been talking about MISO and energy specifically, but SWEPCO, who operates in Northwest Louisiana, is integrated with the Southwest Power Pool, where there is a lot of onshore wind, and they've got large PPAs with onshore wind, but there were some initial requests to certify that they ultimately withdrew because of the transmission component of that. So yes, that wind was about 3 cents, but that did not include the transmission costs. And what we're seeing on solar coming in with very cheap prices, and I guess one of the beauties of it is it can be built right on the grid. So you're seeing transmission built next to substations, next to existing transmission corridors, and there is no transmission piece. So you're seeing those cheaper prices, and they are what they are. And you know, we certified one recently for energy. There's multiple more in the hopper right now. Now there's some stuff that went on at the legislature, and I'm not going to opine on that may cause some concerns with that, but we do have a couple of meetings on that next week. But one other thing I want to add too about, and I know there's a question down, so I'll preemptively answer this one about the commission being anti-solar. It was later clarified saying anti-residential rooftop solar. There's been numerous solar projects certified here recently. Energy, as I mentioned, has a renewable RFP asking for considerably more. SWEPCO's got some as well, asking for considerable more solar and or wind. We've got a group of our cooperatives who had a long-term contract with a primarily solid fuel coal resource that went out for an RFP. It has not been certified by the commission, but it's been filed for certification right now. We're going through the docketed process, but 30% of that portfolio roughly is solar, utility large scale solar that came in at, and I'm not going to say the prices because they're confidential, but came in at very attractive prices. And it's part of a portfolio mix. So the commission is, what they ultimately do on that, I don't know. That's going to be their call, but I think the commission is not anti-renewables at all. Looking at the price, where they are, the reliability associated with that, I think the recent actions of it go to that point.
Thanks, Brendan. Anyone else care to hop in on kind of ways to work through roadblocks for offshore wind in particular?
Sure, I can briefly kind of. I think what's important is the right vector of energy to the right place at the right time isn't just offshore wind. And I probably shouldn't say this because I'm responsible for offshore wind in Shell, but it is about that, Brandon, as you were saying, that portfolio mix, and it's about having the right assets to manage the intermittency. It's about the right behaviors, enabling the right investments in the right place, whether that's battery storage, liquefaction, whatever it may be. I think what we shouldn't underestimate is what offshore wind also offers in terms of investment and transmission investment. And offshore wind tends to be transformative to the transmission because we tend to have very large projects that come in, but with very large transmission upgrades comes opportunities for the other power generation, because you tend to create some volume that can then be used. Also, from a supply chain and jobs perspective, if there is a region in the US that is going to be strong at being able to support an offshore wind industry in the rest of the US, you would point straight at the Gulf of Mexico. So part of it also is, enabling that learning curve also means developing projects in the area, because it's much harder to learn from projects that are out of area. So yeah, I'll stop there because I think Andrew was coming off.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. I just had a brief couple comments about the question of intermittency and cost. And, we're really interested in deleveraging out of fuel costs, right? And so there's wind, renewables have all projects have major upfront investments, but long-term costs fall, and the intermittency of the cost of gas, which used to be thought of as certainly in recent times has become immaterial because of the low price of natural gas, has suddenly become an issue again, as we saw this past winter when we forgot to weatherize some pipes and plants, and not we, but others. And so we were fine. But what I want to point out is that renewables writ large, and wind particularly, while there are upfront investments, the long-term costs, while offshore costs are probably far greater than servicing a onshore solar facility, still will pale in comparison to the mechanical costs and the cost of maintaining those fuel costs, the variability of those fuel costs, and in terms of the weather sort of circumstances. I just want to point that out, that for us, we're really interested in seeing our customers see the end to fuel adjustment charges. And that would be something that I would like to see for our customers, because last time I checked, no one's figured out how to cost the actual air moving. So I think it's a really important piece, same with the sun. So we're excited to have, while everyone's point about the redesign of the grid to sort of buffet the variability and the intermittency is very important. I think storage, as many have pointed out, is extremely important in that, and we're very interested in seeing storage. I think the intermittency of gas cost is something that I'd like to see sort of come out of the picture for our customers, and that's what we're excited about.
Thank you, Andrew. Logan, I see you raised your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to point out something connected to what Andrew is saying, is that the issue, of course, the issue that was experienced in Rhode Island with the Block Island folks is they were paying for diesel, which of course is connected to international fuel markets. And if indeed Louisiana continues on a track to liquefy and transmit gas, that continues to tether Louisiana's fuel prices to international markets. And so, as Andrew is saying, anything that we can do to reduce that volatility is truly an opportunity to reduce costs in the long term.
Thanks, Logan. On the price, I was able to do some quick research on pricing things out, and the Block Island project was 24.4 cents per kilowatt hour with 3.5% per year increase. I think in 2019 it said it was at 26 cents. But the Vineyard Wind project, which just received its record of decision, final permits, is at 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And the article, at least that I read, said it included transmission costs. I think that is a question of, is that transmission just to get you onshore, or does it include also the upgrades that the existing onshore transmission would need? And Mayflower Wind, I'm not sure on whether it includes transmission costs, is at 5.8 cents per kilowatt hour. So certainly, kind of to Logan's point of the bending of the cost curve is something that we're seeing, and it's happening in real time. Since even the last year's NREL report, which I think Logan said it was based on 2016 numbers or estimates.
Yeah, the BOEM report on Gulf of Mexico, it based on the data in that report, looks like it was based on 2016 data. And then by the time the NREL ATB came out in July of last year, it was already lower. And so we're fully expecting that the NREL ATB, which is due again July this year, will be even lower, because it will include, of course, those new federal tax incentives.
So don't quote me on those numbers. I found them while hosting a webinar, but they seem like reliable sources. Paul, do you want to, we're coming up, we have 9 minutes till the top of the hour. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. You posed some overarching questions. I wanted to see kind of if you wanted to reframe them, just kind of as we start to wrap up.
Well, the big one, I think, that really hasn't been sort of completely grappled with yet is what the industry wants and stakeholders want from state regulators, and what, if anything, state regulators can do to facilitate the development of wind energy, which is going to ultimately result in safe, reliable energy being delivered at the lowest reasonable cost. Because we sort of can't put aside that last part of it. I'm fully cognizant of long-term versus short-term and the issues that Andrew raised, and that's the way we plan, or that's the way we try to plan. That's me speaking now, but that one I'm confident the commission would agree with me on. But if anybody has any thoughts on that, fine. But if not, if you've got a couple of lingering questions from the rest of the audience, they're only going to have us for another 5 or 6 minutes or longer, because otherwise I got to go back to work. So I can stay a few more minutes.
Paul, I mean, I can go ahead. It's a tough question, obviously, but I'll try to answer it. I think one thing with just, with offshore wind being one, things move relatively quick right now with everything we see changing, and it goes to the points we discussed earlier. It's not just offshore wind, it's all the renewable kind of increases we're seeing, and how the system needs to adapt to that. And it does include not just the renewable resources, but the resources that need to react to intermittency, the transmission system that needs to develop. So, I think we have the framework to do it right at the commission. It's just going to take us doing it together and collaborating as we have in the past, and moving as quickly as we can through the processes that are well established to make sure that we are making the right holistic decisions that ensure reliability at the lowest reasonable cost, because it takes all of this working together, including offshore wind, whether it's now or in the future, for all of us to get together and make sure that all works as a system to keep the lights on at the lowest cost possible.
I think I would absolutely echo that. I think cooperation and coordination is going to be key, and I think there's a really strong precedent, certainly for this, given where we learn, certainly offshore in practice for oil and gas in the region. I think making sure it's really important, and maybe I shouldn't say it as a developer or as a project person, but making sure that people clearly understand the behaviors that will be elicited from any solicitations or structures of PPAs or awards, or how you incentivize people. So make sure the unintended consequence isn't necessarily, maybe you could say the prices you quoted from the East Coast are going to be under pressure, because as the transmission increases and the cost of transmission for future projects, because you take the easy and cheaper capacity first, then the next set of transmission gets more, unless you go for the coordinated approach of maybe biting off the more expensive to make the overall 8 gigawatts of integration cheaper than the cheap 2 gigawatts, and then it goes asymptotic and the costs really go through the roof. So what's politically acceptable to achieve the goals you want, and how the behaviors of the policies, the regulation and the structures and the commercial structures work. And then from a BOEM perspective, I can ask Josh, and maybe cheekily, one thing that we always do is we consider what we're going to build and how we're going to build it, and we make sure we review that. Being able to bring innovation in through the process and through the BOEM and consenting process as they come along is really important. Otherwise, we might end up delivering projects we imagined were cutting edge 4 years before, which no longer are. So that flexibility of how we can ensure we're doing the right thing all the time is key. How we kind of bite that off, I don't have the answers to, but that would certainly be what I'd ask for.
Look, thank you. Logan, do you have your hand raised?
Just a final pitch for policies that provide some certainty, policies that don't just say, hey, we want to reach a certain level of decarbonization in our system, but say, provide a pathway to get there, and not just a cliff that we're quickly gearing up to hit. So, really building out rules and requirements that provide that pathway and certainty for development, I think is a really important piece of this.
Thank you, Logan. We have 3 minutes left. I do want to be respectful of time. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up?
Harry, I just have, I would really just like to thank Logan and Jonathan and Brandon, James, Andrew, Jennifer, and Josh for all the time and the effort they put into this to get prepared and to participate, as well as all those folks who listened in and asked those terrific questions. It's been a pleasure participating in this.
I fully concur. I appreciate all of your participation, panelists, and yours. Thank you, Paul, for moderating. These are some very heady issues, and they're complicated. That's why we have a lot of smart people working on it. And so I'm very encouraged by the discussion that was had here today. And it seems like we need to get our arms wrapped around the cost and kind of understand the price per for transmission as well, and kind of how that falls in and factors in, as well as planning the transmission component and kind of making sure that we're aligned there.
And Harry, most of all to you for putting this all together.
It is my pleasure, and it is really, it's always a pleasure to have an interesting conversation with very engaged folks and very informed. So thank you to our audience. We have one more day left in Louisiana Wind Week tomorrow. A little bit of a plug, same time, but we'll have two roundtable discussions, really trying to pack it all in. The first one will be moderated by Joseph Ogeron, Louisiana State Representative from District 54, and he'll be moderating a panel of existing market participants in the offshore wind supply chain. And then our second panel, which will probably start around 10 o'clock, will be moderated by Brad Lambert, Deputy Secretary from Louisiana Economic Development, really digging into the economic development component. We'll have some of our regional economic development organizations, as well as some of our ports to discuss opportunities and existing capacity there. So we'll certainly be going out on a high note, and this was a fantastic panel. Thank you all. Until tomorrow, please be well, and thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.